This is Justin DiLoretto, aka Mooch. I was a chapter president of the Mongols Motorcycle Club and a member of the Mongols Motorcycle Club. This is how crime works. Motorcycle clubs are pretty adamant to not be called gangs. We all came together for the love of motorcycles. The downside is the motorcycle clubs keep shooting each other. We're going to keep getting labeled as gangs and be on, watch lists. And the Mongols have a saying that's respect few, fear none. They don't have a lot of respect for the other clubs and they don't fear anybody. The Mongols started in East Los Angeles, Montebello. The original members decided on the name Mongols because of Genghis Khan and the Mongol horde that expanded across the world. And so that was kind of the goal of the Mongols Motorcycle Club, was they were a horde that were just nomadic adventuring and taking over the country. Not only did I have to get voted in by the chapter, but I had to do an interview with members of Mother Chapter and had to get voted in by them too. And the Mother Chapter is the original founding chapter of the club. When I first started the Mongols in Oregon, there was 6 members, and so we were pretty small, but I was elected the president. I started a lot of new chapters. Every chapter in Oregon, I essentially helped start, most of Washington. So, once you became a full patch member of the Mongols, you were given that 1%er diamond. The 1%er diamond designated that we were one of the major clubs in the country. We were bigger than those other clubs. Initially, the 1%er definition was the 1% of the motorcycle clubs that didn't abide by the rules of the American Motorcycle Association. It's changed over the years, and it's more of those old school dominant clubs that have that designation now. On the front of their vest, it would say Mongols, then below it would say the state you're in, the chapter you were in, and at the top, black and white bars were called officer bars. It meant you were an officer within that chapter. I think the Mongols are very militant, and a lot of that comes from not only Vietnam veterans, but as eras progressed, they had veterans from all of the wars. So a lot of ex-soldiers joined the Mongols, and then you also get a lot of members from street gangs, so they come from structured, rule-based environments as well. And so they maintain a very high structure and a very militant structure. A lot of that's for safety and security, but it's also a presence so that, it makes it so that other clubs don't want to mess with you because they could tell that you're ready for it at any time. By the time I joined the Mongols, they were heavily in war with the Hells Angels and the Mexican Mafia. And so the risks that came with that were pretty high. And so, there was the excitement of being a member, but also kind of the fear and anxiety that came with that. The Hells Angels have been the rivals of the Mongols pretty much from day one, and there's been times of peace, but never cordial coexistence. As the Mongols started getting bigger in California, they were showing up to the same place as the Hells Angels. The Hells Angels were the dominant, well-respected clubs. There was a lot of ego involved, and the Mongols used to wear a bottom rocker that said SoCal for Southern California, where the Hells Angels were the only club in the state that had one that said California. So the Mongols decided they were going to wear a California bottom rocker, and they've pretty much been fighting over that since. Ruben Doc Cavazos was the national president of the Mongols up until early 2008. And then he was arrested in that big Black Rain indictment. And then during that indictment, he ended up becoming an informant and turning against the club. And then he went into witness protection after he got out of prison. Doc had instigated and organized a lot of the criminal activity. And then when he was facing time for it, he decided to tell on everyone else that was doing it, which were primarily doing it for him or through him. One of the things that Doc Cavazos was charged with was telling the club to go to war. When we would run into rival clubs, it was to the point where it was no longer fistfights, and someone would generally pull out a gun or a knife and there would be shooting pretty quickly. So it happened more common than I'd like to admit. Generally, we try and have that stuff pretty planned out. Often the membership was there to protect the president, so even if you might have thrown the first punch, you're generally getting pulled out or people are protecting you. But there's always the guys that stand in the background that stay armed in case anyone else pulls out any weapons. So it's pretty structured in that regard. But I would say primarily my biggest thing was that I was always the one trying to calm things down or cool things out, stop them from escalating. A lot of the times the clubs, we would try and speak with the other clubs. We did a lot of sit downs with the Hells Angels or the Outlaws, and we would try and just keep each other's members apart. So I think all the clubs are working to try and not let that happen, but it does. And even though they might not tell you it's an order, it's expected, obviously. So you don't want to be that member that ran into a Hells Angel and didn't do something. There's a lot of stuff in the news where, Hells Angels are shot off their bikes or shot at the gas station or on road trips. It was pretty common to hear about people getting shot off motorcycles in California. Having peace with the Hells Angels at this point would be difficult. Too many members were killed on both sides of the fence. There's a lot of hostilities and anger, and I think still a lot of ego, where one club thinks they're bigger or better than the other. My brother Rambler that was killed was stabbed at a taco shop by a Hells Angel, and then little PK from the Bay Area was out riding his bike and wasn't seen from again until he was found in the mountains with a bullet in his head. And so it was things like that were more common than like big group fights or public fights. The Mongols have a bylaws and a constitution. So the chapter sometimes has their individual rules and then the national rules, which is the constitution. So like everyone had to be at the weekly meetings and everyone had to pay their chapter dues. You know, there was a national rule that no one could sell drugs within the club. In my regions, you weren't allowed to use methamphetamines. You couldn't ever do something that would put a member in jeopardy of getting arrested or in trouble. And that all came to a head in 2008 when Doc Cavazos was initially kicked out of the club in bad standings for stealing from the club. The membership of his cabinet were the ones in charge of the money, in charge of the books, but we're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars. I mean, he stole a lot of money from the club when the club member. There was some members that were actually selling drugs, and then a lot of it came down to, you know, the murders and the shootings with rival clubs and gangs, that it became a racketeering charge. A lot of their rules were established in the 50s and 60s, and they have rules that no women are allowed to be members. You have to be 21-year-old male to be a member, and most of the time you cannot be African American. You couldn't sleep with a member's old lady or wife. I generally don't use the term old lady. It's a pretty old term, and as a social worker, I don't like using it. I know within the Mongols, if you were a wife or a permanent girlfriend, they would wear a patch that said property of and then the member's name. And I know, you know, public perception of that would be that they're the club's property, but the reality of that just means when we're at parties, they know that girl's here with somebody and don't talk to her or don't hit on her, or, you know, make sure she's safe and protected. Once I came into leadership, I had a rule for all the regions that I oversaw that every member had to at least work out 3 days a week. Now, whether that was lifting weights, doing martial arts, everyone had to train and be proficient in something. To stay active for one reason, to spend positive time with each other was another reason, but also to stay skilled and ready.
Some chapters have been involved in larger organized crime, like extortion and methamphetamine trafficking. What's your opinion about that?
Most of that happened prior to 2008. We had that rule that you weren't allowed to deal drugs and everyone had to have a full-time job. And so there were still probably some individuals that were doing it, but no full chapters were doing it, and it wasn't being done on a club level. When I was younger, I started out in the punk rock scene. From there, I got into the anti-racist skinhead scene, which was essentially was a gang. It didn't exist for any monetary value. It was more based off violence and keeping the neo-Nazi skinheads out of our scene in our area. And I think since we were involved in kind of gang life already, that the motorcycle clubs attracted us. I started out with a small club called the Outsiders in Portland, Oregon in about 2004. And I was only a prospect for a few months before I moved to Nevada. I was just expected, after I got off work, I would go down and clean the clubhouse, stock it with beer. That first process is called the hang-around status. And you're generally expected to hang around for about a year. And that means showing up to events, getting to know the members, going to barbecues, you know, just spending time with each other. After that year, you'll be asked if you'd be interested in prospecting. And the goal of that really is to understand the protocols and rules of the club. Depending on what club you're in, that's anywhere from 6 months to a year, sometimes longer. And then from there, you become a full patch member. And that's when you start to have like a vote in church and chapter meetings, which we call church and stuff like that. In the early years, they used to do a thing called the Prospect Olympics or Prospect Games, where they'd have to do a bunch of like crazy stuff, drink a bunch of alcohol and sing a song, climb a tree and cluck like a rooster, like silly things, right? In my generation, I changed a lot of that, and my goal was that prospecting should be to learn the protocol of the club, to really learn if this is the right fit for you, understand how the club goes. And I moved to Carson City, Nevada in about 2005, and shortly after there, I joined the Vagos. I was a probationary member without prospecting. And the same thing, when I joined the Mongols, I started the first chapter of the Mongols in Oregon. And so I was a probationary member and didn't have to prospect. A few months after joining, I got Mongols tattooed really big across the back of my head with a skull with the kind of Mongol logo. I have Respect You, Fear None tattooed on my head. I have a lot of other club tattoos. But when I retired from the club, I chose to cover them up. I didn't want to represent something that I was no longer in. One of the biggest things in being in Oregon is trying to get the out-of-state chapters to come visit. And so we would want to throw the bigger and better parties. They started being like one party would have some strippers at it, so then the next chapter would want to make sure they had more at theirs, or, you know, people were drinking or going harder. And one of our bigger parties every year is Palm Springs, which the whole Hilton would be all Mongols, and it would just be like a 3-day pool party, like it looked like an MTV spring break. So, I mean, they would get pretty wild. You know, I mean, it was a party, and I'm sure people were using recreational drugs, but nothing would be done out in the open. But, you know, the biggest part of the parties were we were getting to see the guys from the other chapters or other states, and we were getting to catch up with, you know, old friends. So, you know, it was just a lot of dudes into motorcycles sitting around talking about bikes and catching up for the most part. Are you asking like why is law enforcement after the Mongols? Yeah, I would say generally it's because of the high profile activities. You know, if there's shootouts, public shootouts, or someone's getting murdered, you know, that makes the news, and I think that's a big part of it. There was some federal informants within the Mongols that introduced some federal agents into the Mongols. So there was 4 undercover ATF agents within the Mongols. So, you know, initially it was a couple informants who brought in more, and then those are the ones that brought in the ATF agents, but there was dozens of informants in the club during that era under Doc. Operation Black Rain was some undercover agents from the ATF had patched in and joined the Mongols, made full patch member. And for several years they were within the club, witnessing crimes, also instigating crimes. It concluded in 2008. Those were the big raids. Members had been arrested across the country. I had just joined the club in 2007. I hadn't a lot of interaction with those federal agents. However, all the Oregon Mongols were raided, like federally raided by the ATF, but nobody was arrested, so it was like search warrants. I had some informants in my chapter that I was not aware of. I was very new and naive to club life, and I only thought in scheme of undercover cops, and there was some guys in the chapter that we had a no meth rule, and they were doing meth, and I had taken them to rehab and was trying to clean them up. And the whole time they were getting paid to try and inform on our chapter. Now, we weren't doing anything illegal, so we never got in trouble for any of it. But during Black Rain, it came out that these guys were active undercover informants. They would ask members to provide security during a drug deal, and it was an ATF undercover agent selling fake drugs to an ATF DEA undercover agent, and they were getting charged with facilitation of carrying a firearm in a drug deal or providing security during drug deals, but they weren't real drug deals. One of the undercover agents, he had asked me to do security for one of those drug deals, but I immediately told him no and went and told leadership that I thought the dude might be a cop, because a random member that I barely know came up and was asking me to do some pretty highly illegal stuff. It was a pretty big red flag. I believe many undercover agents want to glorify their time in club and make it sound more dangerous than it is. I've seen firsthand that many of times they enjoyed the partying, the riding motorcycles, and taking advantage of the brotherhood and having friends, and they got the benefits of it, but they wanted it to sound dangerous. In 2008, there was a newspaper article that came out about the Mongols being established in Oregon and how the local clubs weren't going to let us be there, and essentially was saying that there was this big biker war coming. So at the time, things were pretty tense. The other motorcycle clubs in Oregon had tried to attack us before. There was a lot of warnings we were getting from law enforcement. A carload of some members from another club were pulled over with guns and ammunition. They said they were looking for us, so we were all on pretty high alert. And the day that article came out, an all-black SUV was driving up my private property. You know, my first thought wasn't necessarily it was anything bad, but when they started running from me, you know, I obviously started thinking, well, maybe I should follow these guys and see where they're going. And they went to this other club's clubhouse and parked out front. And it was the club that we were having issues with. So when they got back on the interstate, they were going back towards my house, so I decided I'm going to follow them again. And so I radioed ahead and called some other members of the club, and we were all in cars, not on motorcycles. So at one point, we'd been following for about an hour, and we started to almost box them in. We put a car in front of them, I was behind them, and a car next to them. It started in Turner, Oregon, and then it stopped and ended about 60 miles south in Eugene. I pulled into a parking lot, and the SUV pulled in facing me, but they wouldn't get out of the car. They didn't want me to see who they were, essentially. And shortly thereafter, I looked in my mirror and there was about 20 cops surrounding me with guns out, and I was drawn out and handcuffed. And it turned out that it was an ATF agent and the Eugene police detective. And for following them, I ended up being charged with attempted kidnapping and conspiracy to commit kidnapping. I was held on a $14 million bail. It ended up being $1 million once I did a bail reduction, which didn't matter right at that point. And I fought that case for about 90 days in the Lane County Jail, and I was found not guilty eventually. But what I did get found guilty of was the reckless driving for chasing them. And so I ended up getting put on 5 years of felony gang probation, even though it was a misdemeanor charge. And part of that was I wasn't allowed to associate with the Mongols or my twin brother. And I still stayed very active in the Mongols, and I kept associating and staying a Mongol. So I went back to jail numerous times for the violation of that part of my probation, so the probation violation. Club life's still pretty active in prison, but it's an active member that got arrested for something. And then the clubs kind of stick together once they're in prison. So all the bikers and bike clubs usually hang out together in prison or stick together, but there's not a lot of recruiting going on within the prisons. The Mongols and pagans have had a very tight relationship for a very long time, and the pagans have helped the Mongols expand on the East Coast in like 2007, 2008. And another kind of dynamic that outlaw relationship is the outlaws and pagans don't get along. And so as the Mongols got closer and more relationships with the pagans, it deteriorated relationships with the outlaws. The main issue with the outlaws came when I started a chapter in Illinois. When I moved to Illinois, I told them I had no interest in starting chapters there because I didn't. But things happened, more people became interested. I started chapters in their areas and they thought I was their friend, and it looked like I had gone behind their back. Tug was a member of the Outlaws and out of Illinois. So when I moved there, that was the first relationship I established, and we got very close. And at one point, the Outlaws had thrown him out of the club and he was wanting to join the Mongols. And we were still very close with the Outlaws at the time, and we had an agreement that we wouldn't take any of their ex-members. And so I told Tug he couldn't join, but the Pagans were recruiting at the time and they were taking ex-members of the Outlaws. And so Tug ended up joining the Pagans and he was murdered. And apparently some Outlaws had said, yeah, we're going to get Mooch next, or they had said something like that to an informant. And so when the times that law enforcement was notified, they had a duty to warn and protect, so they had to tell me about it. Blaine's a tougher one. Blaine, his nickname was Scoops. He was a young kid that when I first moved to Illinois was contacting me a lot, wanting to join the club. And I put it off. I put it off for a long time. I didn't think it was for him. He seemed like a good kid. He had a lot going for him, and he was really young. He was in his early 20s. And he came to this event called the Boogie to meet me, spend the weekend with me. And I ended up getting to know him really well, and I really liked the kid. He did jiu-jitsu, he was ex-military, we had a lot in common. And in order to get into the Boogie, you had to wear this wristband. You had to put this wristband on to get in. And because he was so happy that that's where we met, he wore that and never took it off after that. So he ended up joining our support club, the Raiders. He did a really good job there. He became the president, and he ended up patching over and joining the Mongols. And there's a club there called the Galloping Goose that kept saying the Mongols weren't going to be there. They weren't going to let us there. The first time they said that, I took about 200 Mongols to a biker event there in town and showed up to show them that we could be there anytime. And things kind of fizzled out. We had some meetings. They said they were going to be hands off, and then at a bike night, they showed up and they shot and killed him. I was out to dinner with the chapter when his dad called me, because he was a member of the club as well, and he had said Blaine had been shot, and they didn't know anything more than that. So I called my wife, told her to pack me a bag, and I started heading towards Lake of the Ozarks. And his dad went down to the scene to see what was going on, and there was a body under a tarp, but his arm was hanging out, and that was that wristband that he'd been wearing. So that's how we were notified that it was him. He was the only one that was killed. His uncle was shot, and then 2 members of the other club were shot as well. Law enforcement's pretty heavy when something like that happens, and it was very public, and they knew who did it, and they got arrested right away. And then just recently they were charged with racketeering and murder and aid of racketeering. I left the club in 2022. Little Dave, the national president at the time, had recently been removed from office. Him and his wife were going through some relationship issues, and she had recorded a call where it kind of sounded like he had a relationship with an ATF agent, and she had sent it to other members, and they used it to make it look like he potentially could have been an informant, and they used that to throw him out of the club and so that other people could take his place. There was a lot of internal power struggling going on to who was going to replace him. They started changing some of the rules or some of the protocols that I had in place. I started feeling like I was being targeted because of the fact that there was a lot of out-of-state representatives that were suggesting maybe I run for national president. So there was a lot of politics involved. Everyone knew I was loyal to Dave. So I wasn't feeling supported by the club anymore. And at the same time, Tug had just got killed, Scoops had just got killed, or Blaine. The Outlaws relationship was failing, and it got to the point where I wasn't really believing it anymore, so I didn't want to be half in. And so I initially chose to retire, and then my status later got changed to out bad. The status of out and bad standings initially back in the day was if you broke one of those major rules, you stole somebody's money or a member's money, or you told on someone. Not only were there no contact, but generally they wouldn't be welcome around the group, and you likely could get beat up. Nowadays that it's used as more a political stance, it's just more of a no contact order. So active members are no longer allowed to talk to anyone that's out in bad standing. There's a lot of people that I've sent down the road, so to speak, or kicked out of the club for various reasons, and it's never something that's enjoyable, because a lot of times it's someone that you brought in or you shared experiences with, and it's sad to see him go. I mean, obviously I wish I could change how things happen with Blaine and Tug. 2 close friends had gotten killed within a very short amount of time. At the same time, there was a contract on my life, and things were getting pretty serious. And then the biggest part was just knowing that being in leadership, that your actions could have dire consequences on other people. And I had this feeling in my stomach when I brought him into the club that he shouldn't be in the club. He had too much going for him. And so, there's a lot of guilt there that really forced me to take a look at things. Mondays with Mooch is where I just kind of tell my story or interview people that have overlaps with my story. And then I wrote a book. And the book is called The Ride of My Life. Most of the stories within my book are time period specific. So I go into detail of what club life was like for me, and then how I got out and what I'm doing now. The Mongols, they just started expanding across the country around 2006 or 2007, so they're still new in a lot of states relatively. So they generally aren't the dominant club in a lot of areas. They might be the bigger club nationally, but they're not bigger in that area. When I joined the Mongols, there were already some chapters in other countries, Italy and Germany, I think Canada. When I was still a Vago, I had established a relationship with a club in Australia called the Finks. They were one of the largest and oldest clubs in Australia. And at one point, they were deemed an organized crime syndicate. They weren't allowed to wear their patches. And so they decided that they wanted to potentially join another club so they wouldn't have to face any of those rules or those laws in Australia. They reached out to me and I helped them join the Mongols. And so from there, a lot of those guys traveled a lot to like Thailand and Bali and Indonesia. And so they started opening chapters there too. The biggest thing that I thought was different about the Mongols and what attracted me the most was their focus on brotherhood. Coming from the Vagos where there was a lot of infighting, the leadership in the Mongols would stop things like that. So the goal was that everyone got along with each other, and whether you remember from Oregon or California, we were all treated the same. And the uniformity of the Mongols was a big part too, where they have a dress code, a certain look, and whether the members from Florida, Indiana, or California, they should look the same and they're all running the same program. So it's a very structured organization. There was no financial benefit for being in the club. In fact, it costs a lot of money. Being on the road, going to the runs, staying in the hotels, paying your chapter dues, that all cost money. So to make money, everyone had to have some sort of visible means of income or full-time job. There was paramedics, firefighters, I'm a social worker, there's a lot of laborers. There's monthly dues within the club, and then there's national dues that go up to the leadership. Most of my chapters were around $50 a month. Funds that are used for hotel rooms on trips or for having a party, that's what pays for the alcohol or the entertainment or those types of things. The way the Mongols are structured is each chapter typically has somewhere from 6 to 12 members. Some are larger with up to 20 members. And then each specific chapter has an officer group, secretary, treasurer, a sergeant at arms. His job is to enforce the rules and the bylaws of the chapter, and then the chapter president. In each either state or region, depending on how large the club is, there's one member that's called a regional rep or a state rep who oversees that area. And then almost everything within the Mongols is voted on by the membership. So the president, he can make some decisions if he needed to, but it's generally the decision of the club as a whole. And under Doc, that was when they were primarily recruiting guys from street gangs, and I think they were bringing old habits with them. A lot of the members had come from that lifestyle or come from those gangs, and so there was more personal beefs or personal issues that the club butted heads with street gangs over more than it was any sort of monetary value or stepping on toes for territory.
Hi, I'm a producer on How Crime Works. If you enjoyed this video, then please subscribe and comment below with more ideas of topics you'd like us to cover in this series.